Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Mary Cooloff, the President of the Royal Society of Tasmania, and it's my pleasure to welcome you today to this webinar. It's a very special lecture for us, as it's the second of our MR Banks Medal webinars. The MR Banks Medal is a medal that our Society presents to an outstanding mid-career researcher in any field. And last year, for the first time in the history of the medal, the nominations committee was unable to separate the top two contenders. So last year there were two winners of the Royal Society of Tasmania MR Banks Medal, Professor Arko Lucieer and Dr. Eloise Fu. Dr. Fu gave her talk on the 21st of June, and if you missed it, it's available on our Royal Society of Tasmania YouTube channel. In beginning this webinar, I'd like to pay my respects to the Muwinina people of Tasmania, Lutruwita, who are the traditional custodians of the land and sea upon which we meet today. I'd also like to pay my respects to the elders of the Tasmanian Aboriginal community, past, present and emerging, and to Tasmania's Aboriginal community, who are the continuing custodians of the land. We're very pleased that so many people, so many members and supporters from Australia and from overseas are able to join us today. And good morning to the people joining us from countries where it is now morning. For this webinar, the Zoom chat facility is turned off, but you will be able to ask questions at the end of the lecture by using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You can type your questions in using that function, and I'll choose a selection of those questions to ask our speaker. Our speaker today is Professor Arko Lucieer from the University of Tasmania. Arko is a professor in remote sensing. He leads the Terraluma Research Group, focusing on the development and application of drones, sensor integration, and image processing techniques for environmental, agricultural, and high-precision aerial mapping applications. Arko teaches remote sensing and geographic information system mapping at undergraduate and graduate levels. He obtained his PhD degree in 2004 from the International Institute for Geoinformation, Science and Earth Observation and Utrecht University in the Netherlands. His current focus is on remote sensing of vegetation and biodiversity with the use of sophisticated drone sensors to better understand the structure, distribution and functioning of vegetation, and to bridge the observational scale gap between field samples and satellite observations. So it's my pleasure to introduce you to Arko and to hand the screen over to him.
Great, thank you very much, Mary. Just checking that you can hear me okay.
Yes, absolutely.
Thanks for the wonderful introduction, and thank you all for attending today on a Sunday. I hope I can make it worth your while. So my talk today is titled From Surface to Satellites, Remote Sensing from Drones Advances Our Understanding of Plant Biodiversity. As Mary mentioned, this is the MR Banks lecture. I'd like to acknowledge the University of Tasmania for support and my research group and many colleagues for making this work possible. When I heard that I was awarded the MR Banks Award, I looked into Maxwell Banks' profile. So Maxwell Banks was a lecturer and researcher here at the University of Tasmania, specializing in geology, and I found some of the articles that he's written really focusing on the geology of Tasmania, including a paper in Nature in 1975 and a major contribution to the tectonic history of Tasmania. In his career, he was an editor for the Proceedings of the Royal Society of Tasmania for 27 years. And also was awarded a Doctor of Science at the University of Tasmania. So he's had a wonderful career, and I'm certainly very honoured to be given this award. I think the current Vice Chancellor would certainly have been very proud with his focus on place-based research and a clear contribution to the Tasmanian society. So this talk is about biodiversity. So why biodiversity? Well, there's been a lot in news in recent years in terms of major impacts on global biodiversity, major biodiversity losses in conservation responses to these losses, and a lot of global research focusing on how we best measure these biodiversity losses. This is quantified here in a map that shows major biodiversity losses of up to 60–70%. These especially the red areas show areas that essentially where biodiversity is lost potentially beyond safe limits. And on the right-hand side there you can see major impacts such as habitat degradation, climate change, invasive species and pollution. So this is clearly a global problem. But when we think about biodiversity, probably all of us in the virtual room today have a different view. Some of us think mainly about animals, others about insects, some of us think of plants, some of us beautiful, rich, dense rainforests. And so the concept of biodiversity has different meanings for different people. So in order to really monitor what's going on globally with our biodiversity, we need to be able to quantify and map different aspects of biodiversity, because quantification is needed to determine how biodiversity is changing. It's needed to understand the impacts of these threats and also to measure success of potential intervention. And the spatial scale at which we measure biodiversity is critical to the value of that information. We can measure biodiversity across these different axes as illustrated here. So we have taxonomic diversity in species, species diversity. We have functional diversity in terms of how plants behave and interact in the landscape. Structural diversity in terms of how our forests are structured. And all of these aspects are important. So how do we measure biodiversity? Well, traditionally, biologists and ecologists measure biodiversity in the field through local field surveys, either plot-based or transect-based. These surveys give us a lot of amazingly detailed information, but they're also very laborious and time-consuming and often expensive. And they do only provide information over relatively small areas. So it's not easy to get insight into biodiversity changes or impacts over landscape scales to regional, to national, to global scales. So to measure biodiversity globally, we have a whole network of Earth observation satellites. And some of them, some of these programs date back to the early 1970s. So there's rich time series of Earth observation data that allows us to quantify and map changes. So here's some famous examples of a nature study that counted the number of trees, over 3 trillion trees globally, and another study that looked at biomass in the Amazon basin. So these observations are really powerful, but one of the issues with these type of observations is that they don't necessarily give us insight into essential elements of biodiversity that we're interested in. So a few years ago, several key authors in remote sensing and ecology basically put out a call in high-profile literature to agree on biodiversity metrics that we can monitor from space. Because ecologists and remote sensing people tend to talk different languages, especially when we talk about biodiversity. So this was an attempt to define essential biodiversity variables. So variables that are meaningful from an ecological point of view, but that are also measurable from a remote sensing point of view. Ultimately, with the aim to be able to map and monitor biodiversity at regional to global scales when it's needed. So here's a list of some of those variables. And when you look down the list, a lot of these variables currently can't be measured from space yet, or at least are very difficult to measure from space from typical satellite imagery. So a couple of years ago, I got together with some colleagues and we wrote a proposal that got funded, arguing that we have an observational scale gap. We have this gap between these really detailed field observations and satellite observations that can provide us the regional and global measurements. And I felt that that drones and drone remote sensing is ultimately ideally placed to fill that scale gap. Drones allow us to cover a small area in a lot of detail and give us information at these landscape gradients where potentially changes will manifest themselves early. For example, under the influence of climate change, extreme events, bushfires, and so on. So, hence my focus on drones, and this is just an illustration of sort of the difference between satellite imagery and drone imagery. So here we have the Sentinel-2 satellite image acquired in late December 2018, and we zoom into a region near the Terhune Airwalk here in the southwest of Tasmania. So if you can see my mouse, the airwalk is around here, and we zoom in a little bit further, and there's a couple of research sites. So there's a carbon flux tower here and another field plot here. And we zoom in and we sort of start to lose spatial resolution. The pixels aren't detailed enough to really see the structure in the forest. Yet this forest is very diverse and has multiple layers that are impacted in different ways. We can resort to commercial satellite imagery, which is a lot more detailed in terms of the spatial resolution, but it's also expensive. It's expensive to buy this imagery from commercial providers. So the actual research plot is in here in the forest, and just from these shapes you can see there's potentially different species. But now I'm zooming into one of the drone images that we took a couple of years ago, and this is just a single image of covering a larger mosaic, and you can just see me there with my high-vis vest, and what I just want to illustrate is the detail in a single image like this. We can see the tree ferns. We can see the sort of brighter green eucalypts. We can even see some of the sort of dead wood poking out, stags. We can see blackwood trees that are sort of lower in the canopy and have this characteristic shape. We can see a tree that's potentially very stressed, or where there's potentially disease. And so just this simple RGB imagery provides us with enormous detail that is difficult to see from the ground, but it's also difficult to see from satellite imagery. Hence this scale gap that is covered by potentially covered by drone imagery. So the opportunities, I think, that drone imagery and data provides us with what we call ultra-high spatial resolution imagery. So finer than 20 centimeter pixel size, and often finer than that. We can fly on demand at critical stages in response to extreme events, for example. We can fly multiple sensors, passive and active sensors. It's relatively cost effective, especially in areas like Tasmania, where it's not easy to charter a plane to fly expensive sensors. And for my research group, it certainly has provided a real new niche. And it's a big emerging field in remote sensing that allows us that gives us new insights into physical and biological processes. It's the optimal scaling tool, and it also helps us to better understand what we can see in these coarser satellite pixels. So some technology. So we started this project in 2009 with a very small budget of maybe $2,000, and we purchased a hobby remote-controlled camera and literally strapped a hobby remote-controlled helicopter and literally strapped a compact camera to it. Some pool noodles, very technical, helped to soften the landing. Slightly bigger remote-controlled helicopter to lift heavier sensors. And around 2010, 2011, this is when the multi-rotor drones first emerged, and they provided a much more stable platform for lifting sensors. Again, the pool noodles provided to be a good tool. Fixed wing, small drone for sort of slightly more long endurance surveys, and heavy lift drones to lift bigger and heavier sensors. And the way the technology is developed is just is incredibly rapid. This was our first deployment of a multi-rotor drone with a special sensor in Antarctica, which I'll talk about a little bit later. And this is when the multi-rotors really captured the market. And this is one of the more recent one, a DJI Phantom, that is really an expensive Christmas present for for a lot of people. And but for us, it's been a magnificent mapping tool. It's such a stable platform. The imagery and quality is very, very good. And we use this commercial drone to lift our heavier sensors. So they fly for about 15 minutes. Some of the smaller ones for a little bit longer, up to half an hour. We can lift multiple sensors. But I'd like to stress here that for us, it's not about the drones. It's about the sensors that we can carry. The drones are really just the hook in the sky that allows us to lift those sensors and position them where we want to. So this is a collection of sensors, and I'll focus on some of them in more detail, but we fly spectral radiometers, standard RGB cameras, multispectral sensors, thermal sensors, and laser scanners. And in my group, I found that really rewarding to know more about these sensors and to be able to operate them myself. My background is in physical geography, specialized in remote sensing, but ultimately I'm a user of data. And this project has really allowed me to really learn more about the sensors, how they work, how to collect good quality data. And it gives me the opportunity to operate these sensors in the field, develop processing workflows all the way to the end products that I then ultimately use to better understand forest structure, for example. I'll focus a little bit more on technology before looking at some examples of the data that we've collected in recent years. So the first one is laser scanning or airborne laser scanning, where essentially a laser scanner on board an aircraft or a drone sends laser pulses down to Earth, and the laser scanner measures the time it takes for the laser to travel down to Earth to reflect off all these objects and basically travel back to the sensor. It then uses that to determine the distance. And then we have some other sensors on the aircraft, such as GPS or GNSS, to work out where the sensor is, where the aircraft is, and the IMU to determine the orientation. With the combination of those three, we can generate 3D point clouds, three-dimensional. We collect three-dimensional information of the Earth's surface and all objects on top of the surface. Now, in recent years, we've been able to benefit from this technology through the reduction in cost of laser scanners in the automotive industry. So this is an example of the Google car. And these laser scanners are used to essentially build up a three-dimensional picture of the environment in real time. And that allows a computer on board of a car to work out where the obstacles are. Okay, so we basically mount this small scanner, mounted this scanner on the drone. So it's looking straight down and it basically scans the surface underneath. And that then results in these amazingly detailed 3D point clouds. So this is an example of a couple of trees where every single point is a laser strike. And this scanner scans at about 100,000 points per second. Now, this is something you can't easily get from satellite, and obtaining these three-dimensional models of the forest and individual trees really help us to better understand forest structure in this case. Another technology is imaging spectroscopy. And spectroscopy is essentially a science used in analytical chemistry to identify objects, identify materials based on their spectral fingerprint. So materials are illuminated with a light source, and the reflected light is then measured with this hyperspectral camera. And the way that an object reflects light is measured by this device, and the way that these spectral signatures are recorded and the patterns in these spectral signatures essentially provides a unique fingerprint of these materials. So these cameras can also be mounted on drones and ultimately can also be flown on satellites in space. So here we have an example of a hyperspectral and a multispectral camera. So a hyperspectral camera has hundreds of spectral bands to capture the reflected light along many narrow spectral bands. And a multispectral camera captures discrete channels, discrete bands. And with this technology, we can learn a lot about plants, about vegetation, and about, we'll see in a minute, about biodiversity. The third technology that I want to highlight from recent years is a technology that is called structure from motion. So it's a technology that's heavily heavily inspired by traditional photogrammetry and by human vision. So we can take two photos in stereo, and that allows us to perceive depth. But in the last 10 to 20 years or so, this discipline has undergone a lot of change. Through computer vision, we're now able to essentially throw hundreds of overlapping photographs at the algorithm. And from the overlap and correspondence between photographs, it can extract a 3D model, so 3D features from the overlapping imagery, and it can also work out where the cameras were when the photo was taken. And again, this technology was adopted for drone observations. So we can fly a camera over an area, map this area in very high overlap, and extract 3D and color information of the area. Okay, so how is this related to biodiversity? Well, first of all, that very detailed three-dimensional information allows us to capture information on vegetation height, vegetation cover, so this is the vertical and this is the horizontal component, and also structural complexity. So to work out how structurally complex a forest is, we need this really detailed 3D information. And again, this is difficult to do from space. We need spectral information, so spectral reflectance information to determine things like species diversity in a forest, to determine things like pigment concentration, like chlorophylls and carotenoids, to determine water content in plants. And the beauty about spectral observations is that this can be done remotely. Yeah, so there's a whole discipline or subdiscipline called spectronomics, where there's a global effort to catalog a whole bunch of different species to determine and work out how they behave spectrally and how their spectral or optical signature is related to their chemical composition, pigment composition, and so on. So ultimately, the aim is that we can fly one of these hyperspectral sensors over an area and remotely, for each pixel, determine the pigment concentration, the water content at the leaf level, and species diversity. And some of these elements then can tell us something about the functional diversity of a forest. In other words, how the forest functions and the role it plays in our ecosystems. So ultimately, my project, or our project, I should say, is designed to determine how drones can improve mapping of these morphological traits and these spectral traits to really get a better handle on what we see in satellite pixels, to get a better handle on the spatial patterns of functional diversity in these forests. Now, this was demonstrated a few years ago by a Swiss team, and this is an area in Switzerland where they took airborne hyperspectral data and LiDAR data and produced these beautiful maps of physiological traits, looking at leaf water, chlorophyll, and carotenoid pigments, and morphological traits, so height, density, and layering. And these maps have really sort of stimulated me to try and pursue that here in Australia, to work out if we can use this technology to map these traits and diversity in Australian ecosystems at very high spatial detail. And what I'll show next are some attempts. So the first one is looks at a first step, so looking at biodiversity metrics across Australian ecosystems, and I'll mainly present what some of these ecosystems look like and some of the early data we've collected, because this is an ongoing effort. Also look at a local local impacts of bushfire in the Huon region, and finally biodiversity in Antarctica as 3 different case studies in this talk. So 3 study sites, and this is work carried out by Leonard Hembrecht at the University of Tasmania. So he's my PhD student. And in September last year, we visited these 4 sites from the Cooloola rainforest near Fraser Island, Samford Valley near Brisbane, Tumbarumba is an alpine ash forest at 1,200 meters, and then finally a forested site near Swansea on the east coast of Tasmania. So some photos. So this is a rainforest near Cooloola on a what is known as a chronosequence. This is a relic dune area that is very biodiverse. And so here we're flying a LiDAR instrument across the canopy. This is an image looking down upon the site. I'll go through some of these images quite quickly. It's just to give you an impression of I suppose, the difference in biodiversity across these Australian ecosystems. Amazing trees, and this is a multispectral image. It's an odd color if you're not used to looking at these images. But what we're looking at here is the reflected light in the near infrared. In near infrared, the red and the green, and the different sort of hues in pink and red are often indicative of different species and potentially different pigment composition. So zooming in here, we can really see the individual tree crown. So this is a very open crown with, you can see the branching structure, and you can see how immensely complex a forest like this is, with lots of layering in the canopy, overlapping tree crowns. And this is something that that is again practically impossible to map from space, even from very high resolution satellite imagery. Another ecosystem nearby, so this is a mangrove system, and the next photo shows Leonard's with this terrestrial laser scanner scanning the structure of this mangrove system. Again, nearby a very diverse coastal forest. We're flying right next to the mangroves. And so in this case, there's quite a lot of understory in this forest. So we have clear layering in this coastal forest. And this shows some example of hyperspectral images. So with this sensor, essentially we're now taking that lab technique outside with imaging spectroscopy. And for each pixel, we get this spectral signature where that all the lumps and bumps in the spectral signature can potentially be used to extract pigment concentration in these tree canopies, and potentially then allows us to map the pigment concentration as one of the indicators of functional diversity across the landscape. This is a sort of a more of an urban site near Brisbane. It's a much more open forest, and again, this is Leonard with a terrestrial laser scanner scanning the forest. So it's a lot more open, not as much understory. But again, from the top, it's difficult to see the differences between these different forests unless we really use that 3D information. Again, multispectral imagery. So we're looking at near-infrared reflectance. That sort of yellow tinge that shines through is the undergrowth or the bare soil underneath. And then one of the things we're looking at is to translate that spectral information into vegetation indices that we can then potentially relate to some of those biodiversity metrics that I mentioned earlier. And we're in the process now of establishing those relationships and modeling these functional diversity metrics. This is finally the Tumbarumba forest, so Alpine ash forest. It's at 1,200 meters. This is also an active research site with TERN, the Terrestrial Ecosystem Research Network, where they constantly measure the carbon flux into and out of this forest. So very tall trees, and again more complex structure with a clear understory. Now, I hope the next section comes across all right. So this is a video that Leonard produced. So it basically shows the laser scanning drone, Dr. Darren Turner taking off here in a clearing in the forest. We tend to fly quite close to the canopy. So around, in this case, it's around 50 meters. This shows Dr. Will Woodgate, who's now at the University of Queensland, climbing the flux tower and actually installing some instrumentation. And during several days, we've flown multiple times with this drone with different instruments to essentially map the area around the flux tower to really capture the 3D structure of the tower, of the forest, and also the spectral reflectance. So Leonard's work is now looking at canopy height and structural metrics, and this is a summary of some of these different study sites. And this is very preliminary work, but this is what Leonard's PhD is looking at, is to compare structural metrics across these sites. Now, locally, we're looking at Swansea, East Coast site. Professor Tim Brodrip at UTAS is actively researching this area. It's a beautiful area with some native calitris there, and but this area is under stress. It's under drought stress. So one of the things we're trying to do here is to better understand the spectral signature and spectral patterns of different species, to then ultimately map and measure the impact of stress across the landscape and across landscape gradients. So we're measuring that spectral reflectance of different species, And this shows that that's sort of concept from surface to satellite. Right? So here we're measuring these leaf characteristics in the field. We're then collecting drone data. So this is an example of a 3D structure from motion point cloud of the area. And then ultimately, we're trying to map some of those spectral traits and structural traits across these landscape gradients and relate that to satellite imagery. Yeah, so again, very different landscape. And I suppose the reason for showing all these images is to show you the immense diversity of natural forests in Australian ecosystems. Yeah, so zooming in again, you can see the individual tree crowns and the different shades of reds and pinks illustrate the different species in the area. And this, you can just see a car here as an indication of scale. Okay, so another brief case study is the impact of bushfire on forest biodiversity. So this is in collaboration with Professor David Bowman at UTAS and several colleagues at RMIT in Melbourne. So this is the big fires, big bushfires in January of last year, where the Huon Valley was under threat, and one of these areas was near the Huon River and the Weld River. So this is a satellite image acquired 31st of December 2018, just before the fires started. And we zoom in, and this is an image January this year. So I'll just flick back and forth. And so you can see this, this impact of the fire scar, where all these areas have burned in the Revel Road fire. Now this is an area where the Weld River is, in the Huon River, in 2018 and 2020. So 2018 and 2020. So ecologists and bushfire experts are really interested in the intensity of this fire and how the fire moved through the landscape. Satellite imagery like this provides us with beautiful information of the fire scar across very large areas, and potentially we can get this information every week, every fortnight, provided there's no clouds. But it doesn't give us a lot of information about the impact of fires in terms of fire intensity and the impact on forest structure. So here we're looking at a small subset. This was what the vegetation looked like in a sort of looking towards the river from a bottom grass plain back in 2018, before the fires. And this is from almost the same area after the fires. Yeah, so a lot of that low vegetation was burnt, and also the understory was burnt. This is a photo from the area itself in the forest, and you can see all this epiphytic growth on the stems. So we flew our drone in 2018, and just recently, a few weeks ago. So this was a photo from a few weeks ago, and the RMIT team also came down to map the area shortly after the fire. And this is just a photograph. So from the bottom grass plain, so very open, into sort of slightly open, dry forest, to this sort of wet eucalypt forest near the river, which is what we call an ecotone or transition zone. And what we can see here is that the LiDAR, so the laser scanning technique, is an amazing way to capture the 3D structure in the forest in this transition zone. So this shows multiple flight strips, the drone flying up and down, transects of around 400 to 500 meters, and then basically merging this together in a single area of several hectares of 40 million points with hundreds of points per square meter. And if we then look at the difference, so this is 2018, And this is just a few weeks ago. Yeah, so don't pay too much attention to the edges. It's just a slightly different extent. But this is 2018 and a few weeks ago. So what we see is that the crowns, a lot of the crowns are still there, but certainly lots of these bushes and trees in the button grass have burnt, and also the understory is a lot more open. And that is clearly visible here. So this is a transect in 2018, and then after the fire, or just recently, so 2018 and recently. So a lot of the understory has disappeared. If we now look at the sort of full resolution data, so this is a single tree, while there's a couple of other trees around it. So 2018 and recently. So that same tree has really changed in shape, and also what you can see is that epiphytic growth on the branches. So you get these really thick branches, and that indicates the leaf growth. Now these are really fine scale elements, I suppose, of the forest that we haven't been able to map before. So it clearly shows how this technology can be used to map these really fine scale features across landscape gradients, which is both very hard to do from field observations and impossible from spaceborne observations. Now the final sort of quick case study before I look at some recent technology and then conclude. The final case study is Antarctic moss beds as a very different different aspect of biodiversity in Australian territory. So I've worked with Professor Sharon Robinson at the University of Wollongong, and we've been looking at these mosses, which are the only green vegetation on the Antarctic coast. So these mosses, they're very hardy. They have a very slow, very short growing season, and they're very old. They grow less than 1 millimeter per year. So they're like miniature old growth forests in a way. And what Sharon and her team have noticed is that these mosses are stressed, and some of these areas in these moss beds are starting to die back. They get so stressed that they can't recover. Now, with a colleague at the University of Tasmania, we've mapped the spectral reflectance of these mosses, and we've done some moss torturing. We stopped giving them water and then looked at how that impacted on the spectral reflectance. And then we've used what we learned in the lab to scale that to the entire moss bed. So this is an area of, of a few tens of meters across, where there's lots of fine scale patterns in these mosses. So again, we've flown hyperspectral data, flown a drone over the top, so we're getting these flight strips. And from that data, we can then work out where the dead and health and live mosses are. Where the mosses are alive, we then build a model, a machine learning model, that can predict chlorophyll content as an indicator of health. So we're measuring a biochemical or a pigment here, so biochemical property of these mosses remotely. And we can produce these maps of the spatial variability of these pigments. We also have another biophysical property called leaf density. So it's effectively the number of leaves per millimeter. And so the more leaves, the healthier these mosses are. And we can combine these metrics into a relative vigor measure. Yeah, so the idea here is we can produce these maps of moss vigor remotely from a drone and cover reasonably large areas that are difficult to measure in the field. And we then related that to water availability from Snowmelt, courtesy of Diana King from the University of Wollongong, and identified that where the mosses are happy and healthy, they basically get sufficient snowmelt. fed to them. And the story is more complex than that, but it sort of shows how remote sensing can provide this unique tool to measure stress and health in these polar environments. Is a very different example of using technology for biodiversity mapping at these very fine spatial scales. Finally, we related these to field observations. So there's permanent quadrats in these areas to verify some of these airborne or remote observations. Okay, so I'll sort of coming to the end of my talk, and I just want to look at some new Earth observation opportunities that have arisen in recent years. And the first one is what I think is a really exciting initiative by a company called Planet. So Planet have launched over 200 mini satellites, also known as Cubesats, and that allows them to basically image the globe every day at 3 to 5 meter spatial resolution in blue, green, red, and near infrared. And so no other remote sensing platform has been able to do that at that spatial resolution. So it's also known as the 50 trillion pixel portrait of Earth every day. So this is a very small satellite that's relatively cost effective to launch and maintain. Yeah, so one of the things I'm really interested in is, okay, and then this is not the resolution that we've looked at from drones, but we can get this imagery every single day. So we can really start to look at changes over time very effectively. And so I'm interested in, well, what can we do with this imagery from a biodiversity point of view? Can we learn more about how our ecosystems behave by that very high temporal resolution imagery from space? There's a lot of work being done on CubeSats. So CubeSats are literally the size of a cube of 10 by 10 centimeters. And there's now even teams in Australia that specialize in CubeSat research. You can nowadays even go to an online store and basically build and order your own CubeSat for just over $100,000, and you can even put small cameras on that for launch. Next problem is to launch it. That's not a problem either. Rocket Lab USA, which is actually has a launch site in New Zealand on the North Island, specializes in launch of small satellites. So you can just see two people standing there as a reference of scale. This is a very small rocket, relatively, and you can go to the site and book your launch. And so the launches of satellites has dropped by at least an order of magnitude for these small satellites. And I think this is a technology that we'll see evolve in years to come, potentially even in Australia. Another exciting initiative is a project called Jedi, the Global Ecosystem Dynamics Investigation. It's a laser scanner on the International Space Station that sits on a pod. It sends a laser to Earth, and it's essentially almost the same technology as what I've demonstrated from the drone, but now from a low Earth orbit platform. And it's designed to map the structural forests along these transects along the path of the space station. And so over time, and this has only been operating for just over a year, we get these bands where the laser has come over, and we're getting this really beautiful indication of forest structure from the laser footprint. So again, this is a new technique from space. And we now have an opportunity with our work to relate what we see over these relatively small plots and areas to what we can see from space. And that in turn allows us to better interpret and better understand the information content in those space-based mapping products. And that in turn should help to better map the structure of our forests globally, and that will help to better monitor our biodiversity. Okay, so are we ready for the multi-scale, multi-sensor, hyperspatial, hyperspectral, hypertemporal data deluge? There's all this data, and again, today I've shown a lot of data that we've collected, but the next step is pretty intimidating, right? It's all good and well to collect lots of data, but we need to do something with it. We need to demonstrate that it's useful. And so it's all good and well to sit on lots of data, but we really need to use it to produce better data products. So that's the challenge for us at the moment. So to conclude, I think we are able to retrieve morphological and physiological traits at these very high spatial resolutions, and that has the potential to provide new insights into ecosystem function and biodiversity. There is an increasing trend to look at functional traits and not just map species, but to really look at functional traits to see how they respond to environmental conditions. This combination of sensors is really exciting, using both the 3D structural aspects as well as the spectral fingerprints to capture the complexity in forested systems. And our current focus is to essentially translate that bulk of data into trait maps that can be used for mapping and monitoring. Our future focus will be on scaling to ultimately apply these products over much larger areas, and that will hopefully contribute to our aim to advance our ability to map and monitor plant biodiversity, so we can better understand what the impacts are of the gradual pressures of climate change, of extreme events, of bushfires, and so on. I'd like to acknowledge the Royal Society, of course, and Mary and the Royal Society Board for the invitation today, the University of Tasmania for supporting my group and research. My members of the Terraluma group, and in particular Darren Turner, Zbigniew Malinowski, Juliana Bendik, and Leonard Hembrecht. Lots of collaborators, including international collaborators, and my funding bodies, including the Australian Research Council. And with that, I'll leave you here with a slide with some contact details and the Twitter channel. Thank you very much, and over to you, Mary.
Thank you very much, Arko. That was a really fascinating talk. Now, I'd now like to invite our attendees today to type in a question for Arko using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And we've already received one question. Arko, have you had much success using multispectral image mosaics for plant identification in forests, or is a combination of LiDAR and hyperspectral imagery more effective?
Thank you, Peter. That's a great question. So this is work we're doing at the moment, actually, with at the Samford Valley site that you'll be, I think, familiar with. So we're using some of the turn field data on species, the individual species, and relating that to multispectral imagery. And this is exactly the question I'm trying to investigate. So ultimately, we have multispectral imagery, RGB, LiDAR, hyperspectral imagery, and the question is, what combination of data is needed to best separate species? So we've done some of this work in for the Warra Turn site, looked at hyperspectral data, at multispectral data, and the use of a canopy height model from LiDAR, and basically found that a combination of data is the most effective, because that 3D structure does provide strong input into these classification algorithms, and can definitely help to better separate species.
Thank you, Arko. That's extremely interesting. Another question, you covered a couple of projects in Tasmania regarding bushfire, forest regeneration after bushfires, and a plot of forest at Swansea. Do you have any other research projects planned for the future in Tasmania?
One of the things that I'm interested in as well is Alpine systems. I'm interested in ecosystems that are likely to respond to change and stress through the gradual pressure of climate change and extreme events like drought events. And I think some of our alpine ecosystems are highly suitable because they are a little bit simpler in structure and potentially have key indicator species that could help us identify these stresses. So that's a key one. Another one is a project in collaboration with the Pipwi and parks, and they're interested in trying to use remote sensing techniques to identify high value species like Huon pine and King-Billy pine. These species can come under threat, as has been shown in last summer's fires in 2019. And basically, we need to know where these trees are, the individual trees are, and especially in the context of management of fires. And so there's a project underway that looks at identifying Huon pine and King-Billy pine from drone or airborne or ultimately satellite imagery.
Interesting. Thank you, Arko. Another question. Arko, we've seen you and your students out in the field in a variety of situations. What are the most challenging conditions that you've experienced in the field?
Yeah, thank you, Mary. So Antarctic operations have certainly been very challenging. Because of the cold, it's challenging to keep the batteries warm, and just to get all the equipment there and get it there safely. So that's been challenging. But operating in forests is also challenging, purely from a regulation point of view, maintaining line of sight with the drones and maintaining a telemetry link with the drones. So operationally, this can be quite challenging and we always have to ensure we have sufficient batteries charged and we can operate our equipment. We have to we have to deal with wildlife sometimes. So that's these are the sort of operational challenges of field work, but I find it immensely rewarding because I suppose a lot of remote sensing scientists, they do their job at their desks because they can get satellite data over the internet. But I find it really rewarding to be involved in the data collection and see these ecosystems with my own eyes, because it really helps to better understand the data ultimately.
That does sound rewarding and challenging. Another question, could drone techniques be used to remotely monitor the health of ecologically important individual trees?
Yeah, good question. So I think this is where collaboration between disciplines is really important. So this is some of the work that we're looking at with Professor Tim Brodribb, who is currently focusing on the impact of drought. And so he's got sensors on individual trees, and it is a study site in Swansea, where some of the eucalypts there clearly are very, very stressed. And so we're looking at collaborating with him to work out what remotely sensed indicators, whether they be pigments or metrics like fluorescence or water content in the canopy, whether those metrics can be used to monitor stress or ultimately health. And so those collaborations are important. So I can't answer your question as in a definite yes, but there's definitely a lot of work underway, not just by us, but by many teams around the world to do exactly that. Yeah, but it does rely on those collaborations.
Thank you. We have time for a couple more questions. Question, have you lost any drones in use, and how difficult is it to avoid disasters?
Good question. So I had a crash in Antarctica where the batteries were too cold and the drone couldn't lift itself and ultimately smashed into the rock. So that was a repair job. We had one eagle attack So eagles really don't like things in the air. And one of our small drones was taken out by an eagle, and it didn't survive. We didn't completely lose it though. We've never had a fly away or anything like that. So we maintain the equipment very well, and I also feel that with current technology, it's extremely safe to operate drones. There's a lot of those smaller drones in particular have obstacle avoidance features. They constantly monitor battery health, and they can even land themselves safely in emergency situations. So that aspect is getting better and better. So no, I've not lost any, but yeah, we have had a couple of small incidents.
Mm, interesting. And our final question today concerning sensors. What are you now not using but would like to, and why?
Okay, yeah, so we're not, I'd like to upgrade our laser scanner. So similar to the system on the International Space Station, it measures full waveform return. So the laser travels down to Earth and it measures every single, it's almost like the time history of the laser and every single thing it strikes on the way down. So it's called a full waveform LiDAR, and I'd love to use one of those on our system. And also a sensor, we have not done anything in the radar space. So radar is a completely separate technology that we've not touched, and I think there's certainly potential for that as well.
Mm. Thank you, Arko, and thank you very much to our attendees today who sent in those questions. I'd now like to hand the screen over to our Royal Society of Tasmania Vice President, Professor Jocelyn McPhee, who is the Chair of our Honours Committee. Thank you, Jocelyn.
Hello, everyone. Arko, that was really interesting, especially hearing how much more sophisticated field surveys have become, and how you're coping with making that step from qualitative data, essentially the images, into quantitative data. So I certainly found it very interesting. And it's clear you put a lot of effort into your lecture. And it's not easy giving a lecture when you actually don't have the connection, the direct connection with your audience. So on behalf of that audience that you can't see, thanks very much for all that time and effort. And congratulations also on being the winner of the Max Banks medal. Very clear effort. So would you like to say a last few words, Arko,
Great.
before
Great, Jocelyn. Thanks very much for your kind words. Yeah, you're right. It is hard to gauge the audience, but no, certainly really enjoyed giving the talk today, and thank you very much to you, to Mary, to the Royal Society of Tasmania for this opportunity. You're doing fantastic work, and I think I appreciate it must have been difficult also to transition to online deliveries, and I think it's worked very well, judging from previous deliveries, and you should be commended on those efforts. I think membership will certainly appreciate that. So thanks again for the award, Max Bank Award. It's very much appreciated. And yeah, thanks again for everyone today for attending.
Thank you very much, Arko. Thank you for your kind words, and I'd like to add my thanks to those of Jocelyn for a really excellent presentation today. And I'd also like to add my congratulations to you, Arko, on winning the MR Banks medal. And I'm sure everybody who's seen today's presentation is quite clear that our MR Banks medal is awarded to really outstanding mid-career researchers. So to our attendees today, our lecture has been recorded and it will be available later in the week on our Royal Society of Tasmania YouTube channel. Everyone who registered for the webinar will be sent that link. And I'd also like to draw your attention to another medal that the Royal Society offers, because we don't offer every award every year. We have a rotation. And this year we are offering the Peter Smith Medal. That's a newly established medal. It was only established 2 years ago and it's been awarded once to an outstanding Tasmanian scientist. And the Peter Smith Medal is a medal for early career researchers. And nominations for that close at the end of August. Details are on our website. It's on the screen in front of you, rst.org.au. So if you know an outstanding early career researcher, please nominate them for that award. All the guidelines and the fairly simple procedures you need to follow are on the website. We hope you enjoyed this lecture. If you have any feedback or any questions, we'd be very happy to receive those at the Royal Society email address that's on the screen in front of you. And if you have any specific questions for Arko, I know there were 1 or 2 questions we didn't have time for today. Arko's Twitter handle is on the screen and he'd be very happy to hear from you. So I know that today, as well as our members and supporters in Tasmania and Australia, we had some scientists joining us from overseas. So a very special welcome and thank you to you for participating today. More information about the Royal Society of Tasmania is also on the website, and we welcome new members at any time. Anyone who is interested in the advancement of knowledge is very welcome to join the Royal Society of Tasmania. We'd be delighted to welcome you. So on behalf of the Royal Society of Tasmania, thank you to our presenter today, and thank you very much to our attendees for taking part. We've really appreciated your participation. Thank you very much.